United States Army is proud to focus the big picture camera on its sister service, the United States Navy. In telling the story of one of its most distinguished wartime leaders, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz.
What if the entire course of World War II could have been turned upside down? Not by grand battles, but by a starving, freezing army that crushed Hitler's most elite troops when they least expected it. What if Japan's seemingly unstoppable empire was wiped out in just 6 minutes, before they even realized they were under attack? These weren't just battles. These were the key battles that changed everything during World War II. But how? Let's find out. Let's begin with the Eastern Front, where a city called Stalingrad refused to fall. The Battle of Stalingrad wasn't just a turning point. It was a total collapse of Hitler's dream of conquering the East. In 1942, obsessed with the city that bore Stalin's name, Hitler diverted hundreds of thousands of troops from more strategic targets to launch a brutal siege on Stalingrad. His goal was to break Soviet morale and punch a hole into the Caucasus oil fields. What he didn't anticipate was the Soviet Union's willingness to let the city turn into a graveyard for both armies. By September, German forces had pushed deep into the city. But this wasn't open field warfare. This was brutal, up close and personal. Entire blocks were reduced to rubble. Soldiers fought hand to hand in shattered buildings, sewers, and stairwells. A single building could change hands multiple times in a day. It was so intense, the Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War. The Red October Steel Factory and the Tractor Factory became battlegrounds where grenades and bayonets were more common than rifles. As the winter closed in, the conditions grew hellish. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite, starvation, and disease spread through the German ranks. Supplies ran low. Meanwhile, the Soviets used the frozen Volga River to rotate fresh troops into the city, some lasting only hours before being killed. Soviet snipers, some of them teenagers, picked off officers from half-demolished apartment blocks. Whole platoons would vanish overnight. Then came Operation Uranus. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces struck, not at the city, but at the flanks, where Hitler had left poorly equipped Romanian and Hungarian troops to guard the rear. In a matter of days, they encircled over 300,000 Axis soldiers, trapping the entire German 6th Army inside the city. Hitler refused to let them retreat, insisting they hold their ground and be resupplied by air. But the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver enough. The promised 300 tons of supplies per day quickly dropped to just 80. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Medical supplies were non-existent. German soldiers began eating horse meat. Some dug through frozen corpses for coats. Entire divisions were reduced to starving, frostbitten ghosts. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, personally promoted by Hitler and ordered to never surrender, finally defied those orders. On January 31, 1943, he gave up. A few days later, the remaining Germans laid down their weapons. Stalingrad marked the first time the Nazis lost an entire army. Over 800,000 Axis troops were killed, wounded, or captured. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and proved that the Red Army wasn't just resisting, it was winning. From this point on, Hitler was no longer on the offensive in the East, he was in retreat. But while Europe froze, the Pacific was about to catch fire. Just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Japan seemed unstoppable. They controlled huge swaths of the Pacific. Their navy had crushed the Allies at every turn, and now they were preparing to seize Midway Island, just 1,300 miles from Hawaii. The plan was bold: lure the U.S. fleet into a trap, wipe it out, and dominate the Pacific once and for all. The U.S. knew exactly when and where the attack would happen. On June 4, 1942, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, launched waves of planes toward Midway. While they focused on bombing the island, American planes snuck into position. Just as Japanese carriers were rearming for a second strike, dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown appeared in the skies. In just 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers were engulfed in flames. Hiryu tried to strike back, but was sunk the next day. But this wasn't just about ships. Japan lost over 300 aircraft and more than 100 experienced pilots. These were men trained before the war, men who couldn't be replaced fast enough. Japan's navy looked strong on paper, but it had been gutted where it mattered the most, in the air. Midway wasn't just a win, it was the turning point of the entire Pacific War. Japan went from attacker to defender. The US, with its massive industrial machine, now had the upper hand. From island to island, the tide would keep pushing west, until Tokyo itself came within reach. And while the US was gaining ground at sea, the Allies were about to make waves in the desert. By late 1942, North Africa had become a critical theater of war. The Germans wanted control of the Suez Canal, the Middle East, and oil. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, had driven British forces all the way to Egypt. Cairo was under threat. The Allies were on the defensive. Morale was crumbling. Then came Bernard Montgomery. Monty took command of the British 8th Army and refused to rush in. Instead, he waited. He built up fuel, ammunition, and tanks. He trained his men relentlessly, and he used ultra British code-breaking intelligence to read Rommel's moves before they happened. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery struck. The Second Battle of El Alamein began with a thunderous artillery barrage, over 800 guns firing simultaneously. It shook the desert for miles. Then came the tanks. Rolling through narrow corridors, cleared through vast minefields known as the Devil's Gardens. Rommel's forces fought back fiercely. But the Africa Corps was exhausted. Supplies were low, reinforcements weren't coming, and the Allies had air superiority. Day by day, Montgomery's forces pushed forward. The German lines buckled. By early November, Rommel knew the battle was lost. He ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The Allied advance became a relentless pursuit. Within months, Axis forces in Tunisia were surrounded and forced to surrender. El Alamein changed everything. Churchill called it the end of the beginning. It showed the world that Hitler could be beaten on the battlefield, and it paved the way for the invasions of Sicily, Italy, and eventually France. And that brings us to the beaches of Normandy. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 5,000 ships, 11,000 planes, 156,000 Allied troops storming the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. The Germans expected an invasion, but they didn't expect it here. Months of Allied deception, including fake armies, false radio transmissions, and double agents, had convinced Hitler the attack would come at Calais. So when the real invasion hit Normandy, German forces were out of position. Still, the defenses were brutal. On Omaha Beach, U.S. soldiers were slaughtered in droves. Machine guns mowed down entire squads before they could even reach the sand. Artillery rained down on landing craft. The tide turned red with blood. But they kept coming. Paratroopers who had landed behind enemy lines at night were scattered, disoriented, and surrounded. But they seized key bridges, roads, and towns. Canadian and British forces faced mines, bunkers, and fierce resistance on their own beaches, and still they broke through. By the end of the day, the Allies had a foothold. Within days, more troops, tanks, and equipment poured in. Within weeks, they broke out of Normandy, encircled German forces at Falaise, and marched toward Paris. D-Day wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the end. Hitler now faced war on two fronts. The Red Army was coming from the east, the Allies were pushing from the west, and the walls were closing in. But Hitler had one last card to play. December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Under the cover of dense fog and bitter cold, Germany launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes. A quiet stretch of forest in Belgium. Over 200,000 troops, hundreds of tanks. Their goal? Drive a wedge between British and American forces. Capture Antwerp and force the Western Allies to the negotiating table. They moved fast, They shattered thin American lines. Towns fell, roads clogged. The front line bent outward, creating the infamous bulge on the map. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was cut off and surrounded. Supplies dwindled. The Germans offered terms of surrender. General McAuliffe replied with a single word: nuts. For days, the fog grounded Allied aircraft. German tanks pushed deeper. When the skies cleared, Allied bombers and fighters returned with a vengeance. Patton's Third Army swung north, smashing through to relieve. By mid-January, the Germans were retreating. They had lost tens of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, and what little fuel they had left. The Ardennes gamble had failed, and with it, so had any hope of a German recovery. But long before the Bulge, the East had already written Hitler's fate. July 1943, Kursk. After the disaster at Stalingrad, Hitler was desperate for a win. Operation Citadel was supposed to deliver it, a massive pincer attack to crush a Soviet bulge around Kursk and destroy the Red Army once and for all. But the Soviets knew it was coming. Thanks to the Lucy Spiring and British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Soviet commanders like Georgy Zhukov had exact details of the German plan. They responded with one of the most colossal defensive operations in history: 5 main defensive belts, thousands of anti-tank guns, over 1 million mines, and more than 3,000 miles of trenches. When the Germans attacked in early July, they ran headfirst into a wall of fire. Progress was slow. Casualties mounted in the north. General Model's 9th Army barely made it 12 miles. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army feared better, but only just. Then came Pokrovka. On July 12th, nearly 2,000 tanks collided in the largest armored battle of all time. Soviet T-34s charged straight into German Panthers and Tigers. At such close range, the Germans' long-barreled guns were useless. Chaos reigned. Some Soviet tanks rammed German ones. Dust and smoke blinded both sides. Radio contact broke down. Commanders lost control. By the end of the day, the Germans had failed to break through. And just days later, Hitler called off the entire operation. His dream of decisive victory in the East was over. The Red Army launched a counterattack so massive that by the end of August, the Germans had lost Kharkov, and with it, any hope of regaining the initiative. From Kursk onward, the Eastern Front was a steamroller. Nothing could stop it. Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, Normandy, the Bulge, and Kursk. 6 battles, 6 turning points. Each one hammered a nail into the Axis coffin. Each one flipped momentum, broke myths, and turned strategy into survival. By 1945, Hitler was hiding in a bunker. Mussolini was dead. Tokyo was burning. But none of that would have happened without these battles. Fought in frozen ruins, sun-blasted deserts, and blood-soaked beaches. Thanks for watching. If you learned something new today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments below. Which battle do you think changed everything? See you in the next one.